So welcome back to part 2 of the lecture. In the first part we talked about museums, which are obviously interesting and relatively easy places to work with as a teacher because they're designed with some educational purpose at their core. In the second part we're just going to talk slightly more generally about other sorts of school visits that might be useful for the history teacher. So when it comes to choosing a site, we just need to make sure that we're very clear of how this site is going to enhance the students' learning, and to think about the very particular and specific contribution it's going to make to children's understanding of history as an academic enterprise. And then we need to think about how we want the students to encounter the site, what we're going to do there. So popular sites for history teachers are relatively obvious, but it's worth pointing out just the broad variety that we could be talking about in this part of the lecture. Palaces and houses, government buildings, battle sites, significant areas because of something that happened or a document that was signed or a group of people that met there, important or interesting localities or places that are just interesting because they have an architectural coherence that tell us something about the time, significant individual architectural sites because there are significant buildings or design features that we want to focus on, places of religious worship, industrial landscapes or art galleries. So all of these are places where the history teacher might find themselves washing up at some point or another in time. One question to think about is the balance between authenticity and recreated sites. So some sites are created for educational purposes. They're not authentic in the sense that they're modern inventions, but they do seek to portray an aspect of the past accurately. So they may be useful to get a sense of the past, to encourage empathy and to open up further investigations. So here are two examples. On the bottom left, there's a recreated castle site at a place called Stansted Mount Fitchett in England. None of these buildings are authentic. They are all built to scale to enable children to visit it when they're studying this period of time, the 11th and 12th centuries, and just to get a sense of what kind of fortifications would have been put up to protect people, what scale and scope of building would be, the space that people would have kept their livestock in, all those kinds of issues. So it can be useful, although these are all models and they're all mocked up in that sense, and in that sense completely inauthentic, but it can be useful to give children a more authentic sense of the space, the time, the relationships, the experience of what it would be like to live in this period. And on the right hand side, there's a picture of a tourist in the Imperial War Museum where they've built a life-size version of a section of a World War I trench. So you can stand in there next to a soldier. They've tried to make it smell damp and dirty. They've tried to put a soundtrack in to give you some indication of the rumble of bombs that would be in the distance. And it's just to create an opportunity for you to stand in the middle and get a sense again of the scale and some tiny glimpse into the kinds of conditions that people would have experienced. So the second thing to think about when we're visiting a site, because in that first slide we were talking about really you need to think what the value is of visiting a place like that, and if it's to get some kind of emotional response, then we need to be clear what that's for. The second kind of response we might be looking for is some more intellectual engagement with historical interpretations. And Wilson and Hollis have written an interesting article where they talk about how they have planned a series of trips over the first 3 years of secondary school, one trip per year, but they've tried to really pick a focus, in their case interpretation, and then to think about what might an increasingly sophisticated engagement look like from the children's point of view. So what would progression look like? So in the first year they go to the castle that I mentioned before, which is a completely recreated site. They focus on getting the children to talk about interpretations, and then they get the children to suggest alternative plans for the site that might illustrate different aspects of life in the medieval period in one of these fort sites. In the next year, their second trip with the history department, they do something completely different. They visit central London, they go to Trafalgar Square. On the right hand side there is Nelson's Column, which is the centrepiece of Trafalgar Square. They go to Waterloo Bridge and they go to Canary Wharf, the new banking district, and they're looking there at interpretations, but comparative interpretations. So they want to look at different statues and public memorials and monuments that are constructed at different times for different audiences. And then the task is, once they've looked at those different interpretations, is to go away and design their own monument that reflects on the nature of British power in the 19th century, at the height of the British Empire, but does so from a 21st century perspective. So it asks children to produce a monument for now, for the current diverse and multicultural population of London, rather than in more celebratory mode, such as the Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. And then the third visit, a year later, is to two contrasting military museums, the Imperial War Museum and the National Army Museum. And there the students are looking at how the curators have constructed interpretations, have pieced together their collection in very different ways. And the children are encouraged to talk about the different design approaches adopted in each of the museums, and then to talk about the implications for the visitors, what kinds of messages are foregrounded in each approach, and then to make recommendations as to the kind of museum collections that they would want to display and how they would want to display them. So you can see here that picking the theme of interpretation makes it really useful to provide a coherent sense of what you're doing year on year, but it also gives the students maybe a slightly unexpected educational focus for each of these visits, and each of the visits goes to a very different location. So another thing we might do when we're thinking about a site to visit is to use sites as a form of local history learning. So local areas often reflect trends and themes considered in textbooks. Textbooks often are very good at illustrating the big national picture, but local history is a useful way to think about how this impacts on individual people's lives. So we can think about learning from the textbooks of the big picture and then looking in our neighbourhoods to get some clues as to how this panned out in people's lives and in our local districts. So we might use a local history project and a visit outside of school to think about building styles, and in particular to think about the waves of development as the economy grows, as government changes, as empires shift and move away and independence is gained. We might think about how that's reflected in architectural growth, or how a previously small garden suburb grows into a more urban area over time, and that leaves behind it clues in the built environment. We might also look at local industry and commerce, and again there are clues there in terms of which shops have been established for longer, which shops are new, whether there are factories, whether there are energy power plants, all those kinds of issues. We can also think about how diversity and inequality are reflected in the local buildings, or in the names of streets, or in the distribution of mosques and temples and churches. And we can also look at monuments, memorials and statues and take note of which ones are significant, whether there are names listed on memorials, what the key dates are, and all of those kinds of issues. So just tell us some distinctive flavour and give us a little insight into how, as I say, bigger national pictures are told in more focused ways through buildings and parts of the built environment. So I mentioned buildings a lot in terms of local history. Buildings function in the same way as objects in museums if we interpret them correctly. We can analyse them in terms of style, and remember what we said earlier about the Egyptian coffin being a place to store dead bodies, but also a place to capture symbolic cultural meanings. So what does it say to us when we analyse a building about the cultural traditions and values being adopted? What does it tell us about how fashions change, and then how are these changes related to broader social and economic change? Here's an example of two pictures I found on a website about trips to Malaysia. A Hindu temple on the one hand and a huge government building on the other hand. One built to reflect a South Indian religious tradition, the one on the right built at the height of empire and reflecting a peculiar kind of British imperial stance, which wanted to capture some of the vernacular architecture in the region, but did so in a typically kind of British way. So these images, if you were to visit these buildings, open up a number of possible routes for interpretation. On the one hand, they invite us to talk about empire, to talk about religious diversity in the society, but in a slightly broader sense, they invite us to talk about issues of cultural exchange and how ideas get transferred between countries, whether that's through the migration and establishment of religious communities in a region beyond national borders, or whether that's about empire and governance and how ideas are kind of sucked up into the empire and then kind of brought around different colonial outposts, and how styles are kind of recreated in different periods or in different places in the world. So by just looking at buildings and looking at what's distinctive about the architecture, we can ask ourselves some significant questions and lead our way back into some really substantive questions about history and historical change. An obvious thing we can do when we're doing these kinds of visits to sites is to construct photo exhibitions as a result of that. So digital photography is incredibly useful for the modern teacher. When going out of the classroom, students can be asked to compare old and modern photos and then go and find spots that are significant or where they've seen significant change, and then try and note what's going on in those areas today. They can also go out and document change in their own neighbourhoods, or they can look for significant examples relating to themes around government, power, empire, religious iconography, whatever it may be that they're studying. Well, in doing this, we start to encounter some of the significant ideas that architects have written about and that relate people and places together. So there's an interesting connection to be made between place and identity. And there's a quote here from Tumolo, or that Tumolo uses in his article, where he's reflecting on the relationship between architecture and identity. And he says, when a group is situated in a certain space, it transforms it in its own image, but also subjects and adjusts itself to the material things that resist it. It closes itself in a framework it's constructed, the group that is. Material culture affects not the isolated individual, but the individual as a member of the group which participates in its balance. Which is just to say that people settle in a place. That place is both the result of their action on it, their building, but also of the constraints. So if you live in an earthquake zone, you're unlikely to build very high, or if you do, you may be limited in the forms of architecture you can use. If you settle next to a mountain, then you're going to build a ribbon development around the mountain. You're unlikely to build right up to the top of the mountain. So groups of people are acting on the space in which they've settled, but the space reflects back both on the development they're able to engage with, but also then their sense of themselves. It creates a certain kind of city or a certain kind of environment, and then identity over time gets built up in a relationship with that place, and that place itself reflects the physical and natural constraints that are evident when the settlement was started. So these are interesting, broader questions about the kind of role and significance of buildings and what they can tell us about a place. But when we translate this into child-friendly language, we might just feel about the feel or the ambience of a neighbourhood. Is it spaced out? Does it feel crowded? Does it feel relaxed? Does it feel safe? These are the kinds of things that we can get a quick grasp of fairly readily. We might also think about the special places that children visit or just think of to remind them of home. The places the government protects on behalf of the nation, national parks, places of special significance, the parks that are important where people naturally gravitate to on a nice day. We might think about the forests, the rivers, the mountains that feature in art and literature, the kinds of things that become defining icons of a state or a region or a nation or a village or a community. So place has a very distinctive role in how we construct identity, and that changes, and buildings and physical spaces can be really useful ways to reflect on that. Simon Sharma wrote a really interesting book a few years ago called Landscape and Memory, where he goes through a number of different imagined places, and by that he doesn't mean fictionalized places, but places which feature large in the imagination of writers and artists that help create their sense of themselves and their place in the world and in the development of European civilization. So in his opening pages, there's this quote which is worth having a think about for a few moments, I think. The founding fathers of modern environmentalism, he says, Henry David Thoreau and John Muir, promised that in wildness is the preservation in the world. The presumption was that the wilderness was out there somewhere in the western heart of America, awaiting discovery, and that it would be the antidote for the poisons of industrial society. But of course the healing wilderness was as much the product of culture's craving and culture's framing as any other imagined garden. The wilderness, after all, does not locate itself, does not name itself. it was an act of Congress in 1864 that established Yosemite Valley as a place of sacred significance for the nation. And Sharma points out that was during the war, the Civil War, which marked the moment of fall in the American garden. He's using a biblical reference there to refer to the fall of man in the garden. But what he's really saying is, while some people, there's a picture of Yosemite here, projected onto these naturally beautiful sites a sense of what was valuable about the world, about what was important to protect, what Sharma is saying is it's the urge to protect, the urge to find somewhere unspoilt and natural, which is created by the way we engage with industrial society. So it's only our industrialization and the feeling that we're caught up in busy, dirty cities that makes us go in search of something which is the complete opposite. But this only becomes a significant place because it is seen by us as being significantly different to the kinds of places that make life stressful. And he also points out there's no coincidence in a time of war, in a time when the country is literally tearing itself apart in terms of social divisions and political divisions in a civil war, that it can't be a surprise that the government then decides to create these kind of calm, neutral spaces that it will protect because they represent something that at the moment is outside of the grasp of people, which is some natural state of peace and tranquility. So what Sharma is pointing out is that even what appear to be unspoiled and culturally neutral spaces become culturally significant because of the meaning we give them and the protection we give them in law, and therefore we can infer an awful lot from the mindsets that go about creating and protecting certain spaces in the countryside. So here are two references if you want to do some more reading about these kinds of issues. I suppose the key thing I want to say is just to open up really the possibilities for children encountering spaces and for asking deeper questions about what they mean as symbols and as culturally constructed ways of making meaning in the world. How do people relate to those spaces? Why do those spaces become significant? How are those spaces created? Which ones are protected? Which ones are bulldozed and replaced at a later time? All of these give us some really important clues about how people relate to one another, how they construct social meaning, and how they're similar to and different from the assumptions that we bring with us in contemporary culture. So that opens up the prospects of some relatively deep explorations into cultural and technological history. In the third part, I'm going to bring this down to earth and just very briefly mention some of the preparatory planning stages that you need to engage with to make sure any kind of trip and encounter with a place outside of the classroom is going to be successful in terms of securing learning.